Josh Paul, the State Department official who resigned from the Biden administration, Paul has gone public. Over the weekend, he went on PBS and spoke about his decision to resign in protest over the United States' continued funding of what many have called a genocidal campaign in Gaza. But at the very least, you can unequivocally call them human rights atrocities and war crimes. The United States supposedly has a framework to determine whether or not we should fund offensive military procedures and giving weapons to certain countries. And that process is known as Leahy Vetting. Or Leahy Vetting, sorry. I keep saying it wrong. But it's after Patrick Leahy, the senator. And from the State Department's website, I will read here, the term Leahy Law refers to two statutory provisions prohibiting the U.S. government from using funds for assistance to units of foreign security forces when there is credible information implicating that unit in the commission of gross violations of human rights. It is named after Patrick Leahy, as I mentioned, and some of those human rights atrocities can include things like sexual abuse of people who are in their captivity, torture, but most notably here, the murder of non-combatants, the murder of civilians. And this is now the policy of what Israel is engaging in Gaza. So this is what Josh Paul had to say about that, specifically about the lack of application and consideration of the Leahy vetting rule that would normally be applied to other instances when we are funding military operations abroad.
Leahy vetting, where units that are identified to be involved in gross violation of human rights are not eligible to receive US weapons. There is a Leahy vetting process for Israel. It has never found an Israeli unit to be guilty of a gross violation of human rights. It's a broken system.
Okay, well, you could argue that isn't that proof that the vetting that State Department does do, you say, of the Israel's defense forces have not found a violation of Leahy? Does that mean that they don't violate Leahy?
Well, they've identified many, but they have not been able to come to a conclusion which requires senior level sign-off within the department.
Just to be clear, are you saying that there have been units inside Israel's defense force that the State Department has been concerned about?
Yes.
Their violations or their actions, you've brought that to senior officials, and over the years, consistently, they have not acted on
that. That is correct.
These questions, of course, were put to Matt Miller, the State Department spokesman, earlier today. Let's take a listen to what he said.
We comply with all applicable statutory requirements and regulatory requirements in our provision of military assistance to Israel, as we do to every other country in the world.
Isn't that what the U.S. pushes, and isn't that the policy?
I think that is right. We have complied with the laws. The problem is that the laws are intentionally vague in some cases. So, for example, they require a determination that something has happened in terms of gross violation of human rights before sanctions, as they were, could be applied. So, yes, absolutely, we are acting within the law. The question is that good enough? And we are certainly not acting within the conventional arms transfer policy.
That is 100% accurate here. Let's let him continue, because we've actually mentioned this before on the show, how in the UK there's a grander tradition of resignation and protest that we have lauded, and that the United States should have more of that kind of culture within our government, and people should be rewarded for this. I hope that Paul, is able to find employment elsewhere, given the fact that this is a incredibly principled stance to do this. He expands a bit on his reasoning here, and then we'll play Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking about the Leahy vetting process, and that's a good news because that's an elected official who's starting to take these considerations into account.
We've seen that for 20 years, the provision of security assistance to Israel, and for longer than that, has not led to peace. And instead, it has used the way it has employed that security is actually led us further from peace. And so I wrote to a number of leaders within the department 2 days after Hamas's attack and said, I recognize that there's going to be a demand signal for arms to Israel. Can't we for once stop and think about if this is actually getting us to where we need to be before we move forward?
And what was the response?
No response.
And how unusual is that?
It's extremely unusual. If you think about other countries in the region, I won't name names, but there are obviously a number where there are troubling human rights records. And the debate over arms sales requests that come from those countries can last within the administration itself for months, sometimes even years.
During your time,
Egypt,
though,
Saudi Arabia.
the United States, for example, I will name names, provided arms to Egypt, widely criticized for its human rights abuses, and to the Saudi coalition
Yes.
that
Read my
has
mind.
killed many, many civilians in Yemen and accused of violating the laws of war
Yes.
by Human Rights Watch. Why do you not resign after those arms transfers?
Because those were cases where I could make a difference and manage through my work and the work of many others in the department to add some elements to it. So, for example, there is a training program that has been going on now with Saudi pilots to improve their targeting. And in the case of Egypt, of course, we have, Leahy Vetting.
Yeah, so he goes on, I guess the clip got cut off there. But he does go on to speak about
We've seen-
the different processes that are applied to different nations in that way. And the undertone here is that paired with, by the way, this Huffington Post report about other State Department officials who are preparing to make a formal declaration of concern and dissent via this kind of cable that I'm forgetting the exact name of, but it was developed during the Vietnam
dissent
War.
cable, yeah.
The dissent cable, yeah. So that people could say how they felt without under the cloak of anonymity. But this man has gone public. It seems, though, I don't think he would. I mean,
there needs to be more of that because
Yes.
a whole bunch of people signed a cable, a similar cable about Trump's Muslim ban.
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
there's only so much that does. Besides, I mean,
him speaking out does a
appreciate it.
lot. Right.
Him speaking out, yes, absolutely. And resigning is that's where it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. And the point there and the undertone is that the reason that this was fast-tracked without any of the normal process of using that Leahy framework is because these are political considerations. And Biden and Blinken essentially said, Israel is our strongest ally, and we are going to back them up in whatever way that we determine is necessary without the normal procedures and guardrails that are supposed to be in place here. And the guardrails are threadbare and horrific as is. I mean, the anchor there asks him specifically about Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the military funding that we provide there. That's the fact that was done while using the Leahy rule here means that we already don't have enough of an institutional kind of break system on the military funding that goes abroad. Yeah, I mean, but at the very least, when you point to that and show that in this instance, even those threadbare processes were not applied, it just underscores how insane this is.
Yeah.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went on Mehdi Hassan's show on Sunday, and she spoke about this in particular.
I don't see how anyone can look at reputable international organizations confirming the carrying and deployment of white phosphorus by the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and say that there is no question here. In fact, Josh Paul, the State Department official that resigned publicly this week, pointed specifically to this issue, that the Leahy laws, United States Leahy laws, require the United States to assess if a government is committing war crimes or engaged in gross violations of human rights. And that must be considered in any weapons transfer or military aid assistance. And from an individual whose role directly involved the assessment and the deployment of these weapons and consideration of Leahy, he himself is saying that U.S. law is, in his view, being violated. And that must be an absolute consideration, because when we are talking about the role of democracy and fighting for democracy, the whole case for democracy, it lies upon and rests upon civil society, rule of law, and the protection of human and civil rights.
It does. Well, I mean, and she's speaking strategically there as she does on cable news about this kind of stuff. our foreign policy processes have been so untethered from the democratic will of the people for so many decades now that it's important to remind
the entirety of our nation's history.
Well, I'm being charitable, but I mean, you can even the language of the changing of the Department of War to the Department of Defense,
Right.
really just shows you how.
Well, you said it from the Cold War deterrence to now it's democracy. And it's
Yes.
Like, oh, for sure, man.
Yeah, right, exactly. There's a lot of obfuscating language to get around the fact that our tax dollars go to this crap and we have zero say over it. And we're doing poll after poll and opposition to the disproportionate, murderous Israeli response is growing. And yet, for some reason, the president, a Democrat who's supposedly on the side of diplomacy and more humanitarian considerations, is sending out memos to the State Department to not use the terms bloodshed and ceasefire. And that story's a week old, but his rhetoric has not updated. So what is Biden?
At the UN.
Yeah, right. What is Biden doing at this point? This is a black mark on his legacy, and he would be wise to listen to these people who work for him in the State Department and work for Tony Blinken, that this is not something that I think average people want to be a part of, especially if they're engaged in public service in that way and they want to be a part of the State Department, which in theory should be the most diplomatic and peace forward arm outside of our weapons industry.
Oh, this stuff comes from the top. I mean, it's the exact thing like the Leahy stuff. It's the people, it's the lower level bureaucrats like, yeah, hey, look at Israel doing this stuff. And then the top level people being like, yeah, no, we're not going to move forward on that. Keep researching, though. Good job with that stuff. Keep it just on your desk.